Okay, as we've been speaking of last time, essentially what we're saying is reviewing the concept of Mashiach throughout time, and today we're going to go into some very interesting material. Last week we essentially analyzed the Mashiach, the historical processes of Mashiach in terms of the Avos, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov to some extent. And we also looked at more closely the connection of Yosef and Yehuda to the inception of the notion of Mashiach, and how they played an enormous role, and how the Rebbeinu Shalom hides the messianic process when the kitrug, or the accusation against Klal Yisrael, becomes very great. And we went through some very interesting principles last week, which the Rebbeinu Shalom employs. We will then review this a little further. We'll go into much deeper later on when we go into the last Mashiach, how these things are expressed also. This week what I'd like to do is further go on and discuss to some extent some very interesting points about Matan Torah and what happened during the Midbar, to some extent on the Messianic concept. First of all, there's a very important principle which the Gemara says, which is a very important principle. Some people are familiar with it, and a lot of people are not. And that is that the intention of the Rebbeinu Shalom was that there should be only one Geula, and that Geula was supposed to be Yetzias Mitzrayim. There was no intention for history to go on after Yetzias Mitzrayim, really, and Matan Torah. But that when the Jews left Egypt and they received the Torah, the Yemosha Mashiach was supposed to start at that point in time. That's the Geula Rishona. And the Chazal say that at that time, all the Jews no longer suffered the condition of death. Right after Matan Torah, the Jews had reached such a high madrega when dying was no longer applicable to them. And, well, what it means is that after the Jews received the Torah, the Gemara says, Poskel Lahem Zohar Mosel, means that the necessity of death, the reason why people die, which is because of the consequence of chet, or sin, from Adam Rishon, was completely purified by Matan Torah and the Shibud Mitzrayim. When the Jews were in Egypt for many, many years, 210 years, they purified themselves to such an extent that they completely removed any kind of damage or kilkel which existed in them since the time of Adam Rishon. That's how extensive the purification process was. And when they received the Torah, the intention was that Torah would be the beginning of the Yemosha Mashiach itself, the Messianic period. One of the important features of the Messianic period was something called Tchiyas HaMesim, or the resurrection of the dead, which they also experienced. Because when the Jews heard the Aseret HaDibros, the first two commandments that the Rebbeinu Shalom said were heard by all the Jews. And then the first two, which is Anochi Hashem L'Kacha, when the Rebbeinu Shalom said, and Lo Yelecha Elokim Acherim, those first two commandments of the Aseret HaDibros were heard by all the Jews, not only by Moshe Rabbeinu, but they were heard by all the Jews. And when the Jews heard those first two by a prophetic revelation, they were so traumatized by it that they all died. Yes, the Medrash says that every Jew died in the Midbar, right at Matan Torah. They all fell down and died. Because what happened was, normally the Rebbeinu Shalom used Moshe Rabbeinu as a conduit for the Nevuah. As we said many times, that Moshe Rabbeinu was a Navi, a prophet, but he was a very special type of Navi. His neshama was such that he was able to receive tremendous ruchnistic, or spiritual understanding through his neshama. It was so powerful. And when he heard the words of the Rebbeinu Shalom, it was through his own neshama he heard those words. But his neshama was great enough, so he was able to hear he was able to be sensitive to that kind of kedusha, because his neshama was so great. But all the other Jews, their neshamas were not that great. So when they heard the first two commandments of the 10 commandments, you see, they all died. It was too much for them. And what the Rebbeinu Shalom did was resurrect them all. He brought them all back to life. You see, which means that the Jews had suffered death and they were all resurrected. And from that point on was supposed to be the Yemos Mashiach, and they no longer had anything to do with death. They weren't capable of dying at that point anymore. They had already entered into the threshold of the Yemos Mashiach. And one of the features of the Yemos Mashiach, the days of the Mashiach, is that death will be abolished from the human species and all living things. Because that they sinned with the golden calf, with the Chet Ego, they brought back the Kilkul, and they re-entered again into the damaged state which Adam entered when he did the Chet of the Eitz Hadas Tovah. Remember, before Adam Rishon ate the Eitz Hadas Tovah, he did not know what the word death meant. Nothing in the world died, him or anyone else. Nothing died. Not only that, there was no deterioration process that existed at all. Nothing in the world decayed or deteriorated. After the Chet of Adam Rishon, one of the immediate consequences, and we went into this quite at length in Resurrection of the Dead, was that everything now experienced a deterioration or a destruction, a degeneration, so that eventually the thing died and the body returned back to the ground. And we have mentioned that death is really a purification process. It's a way that the body can get rid of its kilkul, its impurity, and then again be reconstructed so that it can be completely elevated to a status of Olam Haba. If you recall, we went into this quite at length last time. So that's what death is about. And that's not the topic of what we're saying, but that's the fact that the Jews, when they received the Torah, were on the Madrega of Adam Rishon before the Chet. Because of the Chet of the Ego, they fell down again to what Adam Rishon was after the Chet. So because of that, the Jews had to go on and await the Messianic period later on in time. There's a very, very fundamental principle that the Gula Rishona, the first Gula, was supposed to be the Gula Shlema, the complete Gula. And it's only because of the Chet of the Ego that they failed. Now I have already gone into the whole concept of the Chet Ego, what happened there and so on. And again, I have that also in one of the things, that tapes also, but I will not go into it now. But there's a very peculiar question that we have to ask about that, based on what we said last week. If you remember what we said last week, we see that the Neshama of the Mashiach ben David went from Lot to Moab, his son, all the way down to Ruth. And then it finally came back to the Jews when she married Boaz, who was a descendant of Yehuda. Which means that the Neshama of the Mashiach ben David, part of it, was in the hands of the Goyim for long, long time. The main part of the Mashiach ben David was not even in Jewish possession. There was no Jew in all of Klal Yisrael who possessed that Neshama. The question that we must ask, well, if that's the case, how is it possible for the Jews to have had the Messianic period by Matan Torah? That Neshama was sitting in Moab. You see. So how is it possible when the Jews left Egypt, and they received the Torah, we're saying that the Messianic period is supposed to have started? Now Moshe Rabbeinu was the Mashiach ben Yosef. He had all the qualifications of a Mashiach ben Yosef. But there had to be another individual who become the Mashiach ben David. The question is, how would such an individual arise? From where would he come from? Since the main Neshama that would what? Give that individual his spiritual strength was in the hands of Moab. And that would not come back to the Jews until Ruth. And Ruth was hundreds of years. Actually, Ruth was about, not hundreds of years, Ruth was probably something in the area about 150 years, 200 years, 150 years after Matan Torah. So that Neshama didn't come back till a long time later on. So how would Klal Yisrael produce Mashiach ben David if the Neshama of the Mashiach ben David is among the Goyim? Interesting question. So the question is, how could that have been a Gula Rishona? The answer to that question shows you something very, very deep about the Torah. That the Torah never tells you what's going on, really. In the most interesting stories of the Torah, you read the story, fascinating story, but you do not understand really what's happening there. Now, if you remember, I have said that the only two processes which exist in all of creation are the two tikkunim, or the two aspects of the Mashiach, Tahara and Kedusha. There's nothing else going on. Everything in Jewish history and in world history in some way relates to these two prophecies. There's a story that happens in Klal Yisrael when the Jews were in the Midbar, a very strange event. And this was, of course, after Matan Torah, where Bilam, who was a guy, a big Russia, he was a Navi, he was also a prophet. But he was a prophet of the Goyim. And the king of Moab, Balak, wanted to curse the Jews. And if you remember, he hired Bilam to curse the Jews. You see, because he felt threatened by them and so on, whatever the situation is, Balak wanted to curse the Jews, and he hired Bilam to curse them. And Bilam knew how to do it. He knew how to do it. How would Bilam curse the Jews? What does it mean to curse them? Because what it is, as we said before, the only weakness that a person has no weakness. There's no way somebody can get to you. No way. No one can give you what's called an ayin hara. It's not possible unless you have some kind of weakness already. And that weakness comes from only one area. Kittul. If you have done certain chatoim, that means that there are certain accusations being hurled against you. That instantly weakens your spiritual status. Now that doesn't mean that the Shemayim suddenly is going to begin to do something to you or punish you. It doesn't mean that, you see. But many times what happens is the Shemayim waits. And this is the origin of an ayin hara and the origin of a klala. We all know there's something called an ayin hara, the evil eye. Like if somebody is jealous of you or whatever have you, it can do something, it can damage your mazel. The question is, how is this possible? If somebody doesn't like you and someone is intensely jealous of your mazel, why should that damage your mazel? You see, your mazel comes from the Banisham. So why is the Banisham suddenly listening to another person who's giving you an ayin hara? You see, obviously if the Banisham is giving you what he's giving you, it's because of certain reasons that he's had. So why do I care if a neighbor down the block is jealous of you? You see, why does the Banisham listen to her? The answer is the Banisham doesn't listen to her. But what that other person can do, it's sometimes by her jealousy, she will, assuming for example that you have two people, and one person gives the other one an ayin hara. Okay, it means that one person is jealous of the other person. What is the mechanism what happens? What happens is the person, because they're jealous, feels a tsar or a pain. Okay, let me go on over here. How does an ayin hara work? Again, if a certain person is zeicha to something, whatever have you, a certain mazel, and another Jew feels tsar or pain because of it, that pain goes up to the Shemayim. And the Sultan looks down and says, 1 minute, for example, let's say you have two people, Reuven and Levi, okay? And Levi had a big mazel. Whatever it is, he got a house, he had whatever the situation is, he had a certain good thing happen, he got a great job, he had a big mazel, a shidduch, whatever the story is. Reuven sees this, and Reuven feels a certain tsar because of it. Reuven doesn't have this, and Reuven feels that tsar. That tsar is registered in the Shemayim, and what happens is the Sultan looks down and says, 1 minute, why is Reuven having this tsar? Who's causing him pain? Whenever a Jew has a pain, it always works this way. Whenever a Jew feels a tsar, then that feeling of pain instantly invokes an analysis and an assessment in the Ben Shemala. Why is he having the pain? Because they want to see if it's justified. Then they examine this pain, you see, and they say, oh, you know why Reuben is having this pain? He's having this pain because he's jealous of Levi, because he feels bad about Levi. So suddenly that pain calls attention to Levi. Now, they begin to say, well, wait a minute, why is Levi getting this? So then they begin to examine the situation with Levi. Now, many times a person is not worthy of getting something because there are accusations of ketugim, things that he did wrong, maybe bad things that the Banisham in his Rahmanas has overlooked. You see. But once some other Jew has a tsar over it, and the Sultan becomes involved, he says, well, wait. He then runs up and says, what's going on here with Levi? Why is he this way? You know, we've got to look, what's going on with Reuven? Let us examine the situation with Levi, and let's see, is he worthy of this hatzlocha that you just gave him? And suddenly they examine and they see that Levi is not so I himself. You see. Once that examination process takes place with the Makasik, with the Sultan, then you can't have Achmanis. It's very hard. You see. Because the prosecuting malach, who's the sultan, wants din, he wants emes. He's not interested in lachmanis and so on. So what they do is they confiscate the thing from Levi. So if you analyze the effect of an ayin hara, it's not that Reuven did some magical thing to Levi. It doesn't work like that. Reuven doesn't have that power. But what it is that the tsar of Reuven forced an assessment of what the origin of the tsar is, what caused it, and that forced an assessment or an evaluation of Levi. Now once you begin evaluating and so on according to the 6 measures of din, many times the Shemayim sees the taka, you don't really deserve it. So they take it away. That is the essence of an ayin hara. If Levi had nothing wrong with him, really, or if there was nothing substantial with Levi, or if Levi's hatzlacha was well deserved, Reuven couldn't touch him at all. With all his tar, he couldn't. Because you can't take away something from someone when he deserves it and when it's rightfully his. That's gezela, you see. But you can take away something which is questionably his. And that's the essence of an ayin hara. So if you want to know how to combat an ayin hara, the way to do it is by making sure that anyone who gives it to you doesn't have any foundation. So you should really try and do tshuva and be careful in your own deeds and not worry so much about what someone else is thinking. Be careful on your own process. That's the fastest way to completely eradicate ayin haras. Now it's the same thing with Bilam and Balak. He wanted Bilam to curse Klal Yisrael. How are you going to curse Klal Yisrael? How is that possible? You're going to get the Bonisham, in the Bonisham's name, you're going to curse Klal Yisrael? Of course not. But wait, Klal Yisrael had done Chatchoyim, and they just did a big chait called the Chait of the Egel. You see, that's a big chait, because that's the passing of the Gula. So Bilam knew that there were certain moments in the day when the Bezin Shemala is sholet, when the Bonisham is angry. It doesn't mean that the Bonisham actually gets angry, but somehow there are certain times in the day when the mitzvah din, the attribute of justice, rules absolutely. And if you knew exactly when that is, you can give a person the biggest ayin hara. Because literally, you can suddenly, and it's not, it's true, there's a Gemara in Brachos that says that the Bonisham, there's a certain second of the day when the Bonisham gets totally furious and angry. What does it mean? It doesn't mean he gets furious. It means when there's an absolute control of the din. There's a certain second in the day. And the Gemara tells you how to figure out when that second is. That has something to do with roosters. Whatever have you. Otherwise it's not known, you see. Because the truth is that if you knew when that second day of the day was, when the mitzvah din is sholet, rules, and you said something against another person, chances are you'd be successful. Even to the extent that you told another person to drop dead, there's a strong chance you would drop dead. In that, because the midas of the din. The fact is that there are certain times when the midas hadin is sholet, like I say, and that's what allows the power of an ayin hara. It also allows the power of a klola. A klola cannot work on someone if he didn't do anything wrong. You see, it's when a person has done something wrong and you curse another person that suddenly that sah goes up to Shemayim and the Shemayim examines it very finely. You see. And if it's found to be very warranted, there's a possibility of a klola coming through. And also even an ayin hara without that. And that's what Bilam knew. Bilam knew the second when the midas hadin was sholet. And his plan was to curse Klal Yisrael during that second. And Klal Yisrael had a big kittig on them from the ego. You see, there's a big accusation against the Jews because of the sin of the golden calf. So it was a big problem. Now at the moment that Bilam started doing it, suddenly what happened? Suddenly, the Bonisham exercised an unusual amount of rachmanis. Something changed in the world, an enormous thing changed. Because what happened was, Bilam hit that second. He knew exactly when it was, and yet it didn't help. Suddenly it was reversed, and Bilam found himself blessing Klal Yisrael. Now that was a net. It wasn't that the Jews felt sorry for the Jews, the Bonisham felt sorry for the Jews. What of so on. For the Bonisham to do that, to convert Bilam's klola into a bracha, at the moment when the mitzvah hadin is sholet in the world, and when Klal Yisrael is worthy of a punishment, is mamash a nes. If you understand what I mean. That's an incredible intervention by the Bonisham in such a way which has almost never occurred before in that type of fashion. Because the Buddha literally had to change his own design so that Bilam doesn't catch Klal Yisrael napping, so to speak. And that's essentially what happened. So Bilam wound up blessing Klal Yisrael. And when Balak said to him, "What are you doing? I paid you to curse them." So he says, Bilam said, "I can't help myself. There's another force that takes over of Nevuah, and suddenly I'm forced to bless them." This is what happened. Fine. Interesting story. Interesting Maisa. Obviously, it's a story of Balak, one of the nations, right, trying to curse Klal Yisrael. I mean, he's no worse than Amalek or all the other ones that tried to destroy Klal Yisrael along the way. Another story. But the interesting thing is that we have to ask ourselves, what happened over here? What is Balak coming along suddenly and trying to curse the Jews? Like, what's really going on over here? We find a very, very fascinating thing. Balak was the king of who? What land? Moab. He was the king of the Moabites. So we find that somehow, at a certain point in time, when the Jews were traveling over the Midbar, the desert, they met Moab. Now, why do the Jews meet Moab? That's not a coincidence. What is the significance of the Jews meeting Moab? Wait, let's ask ourselves, what's so special about Moab that the Jews suddenly meet Balak? Now, Balak wanted to hurt the Jews, but let's put that aside. Let's just ask ourselves, why are the Jews suddenly meeting Balak? There's an interaction between Moab and the Jews. Why? Forget about the fact that that interaction was a negative one. You see, there's only one reason why the Jews meet Moab. There's only one business that the Jews have with Moab. And what's that? To take back the neshama of the Mashiach ben David. That's the business that Moab has with the Jews. You see. So we find that when the Jews left Egypt, they were supposed to meet Moab at a certain point in time. That was the Hashgacha. They were supposed to meet him. Why? Because obviously somebody from the Jewish nation was supposed to marry somebody from the Goyish nation, from Moab, and that neshama should have returned at that point in time. Why should that neshama return at that point in time? So because that was the designated time for the Mashiach. That was the time for the Mashiach ben David to appear. Which means that Moab was supposed to meet the Jews before Rus. You see, that literally there was supposed to be some contact with Moab and the Jews before Rus even ever get on the scene. That there should never have been a Rus or a Boaz. The Jews should never have waited till Rus and Boaz got there to bring back the neshama of the Mashiach ben David. You see, so that David Melech can be born. That should have happened already by Balak. But what happened instead? Balak came there and he wanted to curse the Jews. Because that's the story. Why did Balak want to curse the Jews? Because of the kitrug against Klal Yisrael. If the Jews had never done the sin of the Chet of the Egel, then Balak would have come with the Jews in peace. There would have been a tremendous shalom between the two. And in some way that neshama would have returned at that point in time. But because the Jews had already forfeited the redemption, the emerged Mashiach, because of the Chet of the Egel, when Balak did meet the Jews, he wanted to curse them instead. What's supposed to be a bracha for the Jews turned out to be a curse for them. But why? What converted, what transformed Balak into an enemy rather than an ally or a friend? Not because Balak was a Meshiggah and he wanted to destroy the Jews, or he was a Rasha. But what made Balak the Rasha in a certain way was the kitrug against the Jews. So that the meeting that the Jews would meet with Moab would never bear fruit. That's what the Sultan did. The Sultan said, Moab is going to meet Klal Yisrael? What? To give him Mashiach ben David? We'll see how fast that goes. We'll see that. The Jews are not worthy of that. So I went interfered with that. Instead of the Jews meeting Moab for bracha, they will meet Moab with a klala. And it took a special action of Bnei Shalom to what? To literally intervene and interfere with the klala of Bilam, so that it doesn't take effect. That's how powerful the kitrug was on the Jews. You see. So this little interesting story, what happened, can be read on a superficial level. But what really was going on was a very deep thing that had to do with the entire Geula, the entire Messianic process itself. And you find this entire thing hinted, even in the bracha of Bilam. If you look at the Parsha of Balak and you see, Bilam says an amazing thing. He says, I see it, but not now. You see. And it is afar. That's what he says, I see it, but not now. What is Bilam talking about? What Bilam is talking about is the Yemos Mashiach. It means I see it, but not now. It means it should have happened. I see it. The meeting of the Jews and Moab should have produced an opportunity to bring back the Mashiach from David, but not now. Klal Yisrael will have to wait for future generations until Ruth appears for Moab, but it cannot happen now. So you see again the continuation. And there's a certain logic and there's a certain flow. There are certain things in every historical event. There are two levels to the historical event, and it's very important to realize. There's the superficial level, there's the external level of what actually happens in the story, and then there's the internal level of what's hidden. The internal level refers to the spiritual processes which are taking place underneath, that are expressed in the external historical events. Now we only know the historical events. We don't know what the reasons are, why these things are happening. But if we know some of the basic foundations of Hashkafa, and some of the principles which we're discussing in these shurim, we begin to have a better understanding that all these things that are going on are leading towards a certain objective. This is not some ahefka. It's not a chaotic situation. But there's a certain plan that's going somewhere. It's leading somewhere. Just like we saw with Yosef, when Yosef went down to Mitzrayim, and he met Osnas, and Yehuda and Tamar, and the whole story of Lot, there's a constant plan where the Baruch Hashem is constantly trying to bring the Geula, one way or the other. Constantly trying to redeem Klal Yisrael and save Klal Yisrael from the Chatoim. He wants Klal Yisrael to do mitzvahs because he wants Klal Yisrael to build their own Olam Haba. But at the same time, because of the fact that Klal Yisrael also does sins, he wants to protect them in some way, but he's got to protect them in a certain route, so that the Mekatrig is not too strong and doesn't claim that Klal Yisrael should be destroyed. So history is nothing more than this constant movement of the Baruch Hashem attempting to save Klal Yisrael from its own suicidal intentions. That's really what human history is about. And you see the classic case by Bilam and Balak. What should have been a beautiful meeting, a really productive meeting, a constructive meeting, turned out to be a terrible klola. So the Baruch Hashem had to go intervene to block Bilam's klola into a bracha at a time when the Midas Hadin is totally sholet. It's the same thing on Rosh Hashanah, whether you know it or not. On Rosh Hashanah, the Midas Hadin is sholet. You should know that on Rosh Hashanah, the court of mercy is closed. I don't know if you realize that. There is no court of Rahmanas on Rosh Hashanah. It's shut down. It's shut down. There's only one bezdin open up there, and that's the court of justice. Strict justice on Rosh Hashanah. And on Yom Kippur, it's the reverse. Only the court of mercy is open, and the court of justice shuts down. Now, if the court of justice is open on Rosh Hashanah, what chance does Klal Yisrael have? The answer is they have no chance, really. So why are we still around? Because of one simple instrument called the shofar. Because the shofar brings up in the bezdin of Midas Hadin, the bezdin Shemala, and it reminds the Baruch Hashem that Avraham Avinu was Moshe Nefesh, sacrificed himself so that he would literally give over his son and obey the will of the Baruch Hashem. And that deed is able to come in front of the bezdin Shel Din and say, Din cannot what? Control the situation. But in the Schus of Avraham, the Jews are worthy of mercy through the principle of justice. You see, that's why Rosh Hashanah is so unique, because Rosh Hashanah is a day when the Baruch Hashem shows Rahmanas to the Jews in the court of justice itself, because of the Akedah Yitzchak, what Avraham did. That's so powerful that it can go up in front of the Sultan, right in front of his face, you see, and say, we demand justice, and the justice that we demand will save Klal Yisrael. Not the mercy. The Jews are saved on Rosh Hashanah from the Midas Hadin. That's the power of the shofar. It takes the Midas Hadin and turns it around. It doesn't add the Midas Rahmanas. You see, it's a whole different way of thinking about it. But that's really the power of Rosh Hashanah. And that's basically what goes on. The question that's asked, which is a very good one, is that if the Jews had failed because of the Chet Egel to bring back the Neshama of the Mashiach ben David's Moab, then what was the purpose of Moab meeting the Jews at that point in time? if they already disqualified themselves from bringing a Mashiach ben David, why would they have to meet more at that point in time? That's a good question. And that's an excellent question. Here you see a very, very deep thing. Very important thing. That if something is supposed to happen, Al-Pi Derech HaKedusha, if it doesn't happen, if somehow it is not fulfilled, it doesn't mean that the entire thing suddenly disappears. But it means that that chus, or that power, suddenly is transformed into an act of evil. In other words, the Satan, because of his kitzur, now has power or access to that event. The spirituality or the koyach of kedusha that should have been behind that event now goes to the Satan, and he can do with that event what should have been done constructively. He can use that now destructively. That's very important. So you find, therefore, because the Jews failed to make the meeting between Moab and the Jews as one of a constructive thing, the Satan was able to try and destroy Klal Yisrael with it, with the same thing. And we will see this concept over and over and over again. And one of the biggest examples of this, I always say, is the story of, the story of Rus. You see, Rus had a sister-in-law. Her name was Orpah, if you remember. Orpah was married to the other brother. She was married to one, right? Now what happened? When Naomi wanted to go back to Eretz Yisrael, Rus said, I want to go with you. And Orpah said, okay, I won't go with you, She went back to Moab. So Orpah had an opportunity to follow in the ways of Naomi and to take that kedusha and really develop it, right? Orpah. Rus was Megaya, and she went back down to Israel. Orpah, her sister-in-law, decided to go back to Moab. Orpah gave up the opportunity that Rus took. What happened to Orpah? Just she became what? She went back to Moab and that was the end of it? No, the kedusha that was represented by Orpah was turned around and it became an evil force. Because who descended from Rus? David HaMelech. And who descended from Orpah? Goliath. And what happened with Goliath and David? They met. Imagine that. They were relatives really. Cousins. Goliath was from Orpah and David was from Rus. So in a certain sense they were really related. In cousins far, far back. How is that possible? You see, how can David meet his cousin, so to speak, in this way? That's because what happened was Rus went ahead and took the kedusha and did something with it. So David came out of it. Orpah went ahead and ignored the kedusha and threw it away. So what came out of it was an evil to come back against the kedusha later on. What happens is, what the Rebbeinu Shalom says to the Jews the following, and this is a very, very big thing, that when the Jews suddenly have a possibility of reaching a very high level of kedusha, you see, for example, they have the possibility of bringing Mashiach. If they don't succeed, then that power is then used against them. So it's not a question of either having something or not. It's having something or having it come against you in a destructive way. Because if you don't, what the Rebbeinu Shalom says is the following: I give you an opportunity to take kedusha. If you don't take the kedusha, you see, it's not that you simply will lack it, but it will come back to you and attempt to harm you. Because suddenly it will go into the rishus, or into the domain of the makatrig, who will be allowed to hold it now because of the kitzur against you. Remember, what does the Satan do to you? He wants the makatrig against you. He's appointed. His job is to see to it that he seduces you, and if you fall, to go and accuse you. That's his job. His reward for that job is the kedusha that you've lost by doing the sin. He takes the kedusha, and that kedusha gives him the power suddenly to come down and hurt you. That's where he takes it from. The only way you can be hurt is from the kedusha that you once had and lost. You cannot be hurt another way. Nothing bad can ever happen to you. Anything bad which happens to you comes from your kedusha that was thrown out. That's an extremely important principle. It doesn't come from somewhere else, it comes from you. You see, when the Jews look around and they see the Goyim are so strong and so powerful, right? And that they're so tiny, it's because it's their kedusha in the hands of the Goyim. Every time the Goyim run after the Jews with the pogrom or Holocaust and so on, it's the koyach of the Jews that they're using, not the koyach of the Goyim. The Goyim have no koyach by themselves. It's the koyach of the Jews that they're using to come back on them. That's the fundamental principle. Every time you get punished, for example, let's say you're at a job and you meet somebody who is very unfriendly to you, or is really bad to you, that person can't just do damage to you. If you have an enemy, you see, the same principle as an Ayin Hora. Let's say, for example, you have a person who hates you. That person can't touch you. So what, she hates you? So what, or he hates you? What's the difference? That person can only succeed in doing something against you through the Kedusha that you have lost. Because that Kedusha will find its way to that person. And from that, they're able to hurt you. If a person can give you an Ayin Hora, it's because suddenly the person holds your Kedusha. And the Kedusha that that person holds is the Kedusha that you lost. And in some way it found itself to that person. And suddenly, an Ayin Hora becomes effective. It cannot come anywhere else. There's nowhere else it can come from.
What do you mean?
Kedusha comes by doing mitzvahs. All of life is nothing more than a series of circumstances which are always designed to test you, to give you a chance to do a mitzvah or not. When you don't do a mitzvah and when you do a sin, the Kedusha that should have come down to your neshama, remember we said that every time you do a mitzvah, a Kedusha comes down, a holiness, a koyach, a spiritual force comes down into your neshama, which has the ability of transforming the entire world to Olam Haba. But when you do a sin, what happens to that power? Where does it go? What happens is that power then goes into the hands of the Makatrik, and then he gives that power over to your enemy. And that's the power they use to hurt you. Either by directly hurting you, or by giving you Ayin Horas, whatever the story is. They take your power to hurt you. That's a very critical thing. They have no power on their own. And they would be completely ineffective were it not for the power that you gave them. And that's what it is. Barak had the power to try and curse Klal Yisrael. Why? Because the power that Barak had, where did he get that power? Where? He got that power from the Chet of the Egel, you see. Because that was the Kedusha that should have come to the world from the Chet Egel to bring a Mashiach from David. Instead, the Satan has that power. And with that power, the Satan comes back and tries to destroy you. Because that's the essence of Din. Din says what? If you do the job, you get paid. If you don't do the job, you don't get paid. Strict is no lachmonis in Din. Din is very simple, you know. If you have an employee, and you make a salary with them, if they do the job, you pay them. They don't do the job, you don't pay them. It's a business. It's not a free-for-all over here. This is a serious thing, you know. You're paying for work. It's a very straight thing. It's a cause and effect relationship. If there's a cause, there's an effect. If there's no cause, there's no effect. That's what it is. And that's what the Satan is. The Satan is very simple. The Satan says, what do you mean? This person is getting Kedusha to build Olam Haba? How's this person getting Kedusha? This person's doing sin all day long. I want the Kedusha. And I'm going to take Kedusha and punish this person. You know, because the Kedusha doesn't belong to the person. Every person who hurts you, every person who gives you an Ayin Hora, is you looking in the mirror. That's your reflection in the mirror. That's it. There's no power outside of you. It's you looking in the mirror. And suddenly one day the reflection turns around and says, hey, remember me? I'm your enemy now. You see, you thought that I was doing everything that you wanted. You think you look in the mirror and I move your way. You move this way, I move this way. No, I have my own will now. You have made me into a separate person. I live by myself now, and I can come back to haunt you. You've created your own personal Frankenstein. And here I am. What happens? There's nothing outside of you. There's absolutely nothing outside of you. Everything comes back to you is you. It's you, essentially, constantly interacting with yourself through the medium or the intermediary of someone outside. That's all it is. Nothing bad can ever happen to you unless there's a kittug behind it. Nothing. It's not possible. There's no evil that can come in the world. The essence of evil is kittug. So when something comes against you and is matzliach, it is essentially your force that you gave away. And that's the essence. Because there is nothing that can take your force from you. Nothing. That's why the Satan is called a Gazlan. You see. He's called a Gazlan. Why? Because he exists or lives. His power to persecute you is taken from you. That's why he's the greatest Gazlan of all. The essence of the Jewish religion is responsibility. There's no such thing as, it's his fault. Schuldig, he's the one who did this to me. It doesn't exist in Judaism. There's no magic, there's no voodoo, there's nothing outside of you. If anything works against you, it's because you have done a good job in creating the monster. Another way to take back that koyach that you've given away, you see, is to do tshuva. You can voluntarily do tshuva and take back that koyach. But if you fail to do tshuva and take back the koyach, the Baruch Hashem will bring it back to you by tzaras. One way or another, the Baruch Hashem will do everything he can to restore the kedusha that you lost. But it's your choice how it's restored. You see, you can either do it painfully or painlessly, relatively speaking, either through tshuva or, which is your own effort, or through tzaras. And that's basically what it's all about. The Holocaust submits to the same principle. That obviously, and this is a very important thing to realize, it's a very important thing to realize, the Holocaust, there are two qualities that happened in the Holocaust. The first thing that happened in the Holocaust was the fact that 6 million Jews died. The second thing is the way they died. They died like sheep to the slaughter. Now, what's very important to understand is that when the Makatzik runs up against you, he is an exact reflection of your hate. So that he can't come around and do something to you which you don't deserve. For example, if you stole a certain thing, he can't come back with, let's say, $100. He can't come back and steal $200 from you. He can only come back and punish you with some loss of $100. Mida keneged mida. Again, because he derives his power from you. Whenever you're punished, the exact punishment is an exact reflection of your hate. If you look at the Holocaust, 6 million Jews died. I'm not going to go into why 6 million Jews died. You know, each nefesh neshama has its own cheshbon. But there's no question that their death essentially revolved around their own actions. But what's very interesting is the way they died. Why did they die in such a contemptuous, demeaning fashion? Why? There's only one answer for this, basically. Because that's the way they deserve to die. Why did they deserve to die? Let's analyze this. What happened? Listen very carefully, and you will see and it's corroborated by a lot of things. Listen very carefully. What did the Nazis essentially do to the Jews? What essentially? What it was is they treated them like animals. What you had was that the Nazis treated the Jews like animals. One person treating another person like an animal. That can only come one way. If somehow those Jews themselves treated other people like animals. You find this in the Medrash itself. You find that by the Dor HaMabul, in the generation of the flood, the entire world was destroyed. But in the generation of the Dor HaFlaga, when they built the Tower of Babel and they tried to rebel against God, it wasn't destroyed. Why not? In both generations, they both rebelled against the Bnei Shalom. Because there was a difference. In the time of the Dor HaMabul, in the time of Noach, all the people not only rebelled against God, but they were terrible to each other. Terrible. They robbed and steal. There was violence and Hamas. So the Baruch Hashem says, I don't want this kind. I have nothing to do with that kind of a world. But in the case of the Dor HaFlaga, they were all very peaceful with each other, except that they all warred against God. So the Baruch Hashem says, okay, you have a war against me, fine, but I'm not going to do anything to you. So all they did was change their language. So what you find is that the way the image comes down is a direct reflection of a type of hate that's being done. A person cannot be punished by another person in a totally contemptuous way unless he has on his record the exact same kind of activity. If in a person's life he treated other people in a contemptuous way, through lashon hara, through gezelis, through mavayis rabin, who knows how many things, then what happens is that when it comes around again, the Sultan has the reshus or the permission to go ahead and hurt the person in the same way. Where it's not that simply the person will be hurt, but he will hurt in a contemptuous way. If you were mavayis someone else for rabin, you will be misvayish for rabin. If you destroyed someone with lashon hara, you will be destroyed in that way. If you had no respect for another person and you treated them like an animal, that will be what you will get. So there's no question on the basis of Mida Keneged Mida. What the Jews of Europe experienced was some kind of reflection which they themselves were involved. Now you may say, but these people were tzaddikim. But the answer is they were not tzaddikim. And that's a very important thing to realize. They may have been very erech yidden in certain ways. But there was something going on before that in Europe that we really don't know much about because we weren't there. But what was going on is that in the Jewish communities, there was a tremendous contempt that the rich had for the poor, and that the Talmidei Chachamim had for the Amoratim. Even at the time of the Baal Shem Tov, it was a terrible situation. Those people who were Talmidei Chachamim used to look down on the Amoratim with contempt. That's one of the reasons why the Baal Shem Tov went ahead to try and take the Amoratim and give them a simcha and a connection to Yiddishkeit. Why? Because essentially the Yeshiva Shavelt and the Talmidei Chachamim at that time were very arrogant, and they were an elitist group. The Balabatim of the city, who were the richest people, were always the elitist group. And there were constant complaints in Jewish history, where many times there were all kinds of machloikesin in the community. Many machloikesin, people killing each other. How many times do we see in the Hasidic Shavelt, for example, there was a tremendous battle between one Hasidic group and another, you see. And there were tremendous battles, when if you didn't do what they did, they went ahead and they destroyed you. These things went on all over Europe, you see. You think, well, what's going on over here? But they all sat and learned, and many times they were big Yeshua, and that's true. So Ben Adam Lamokum, they were Elech Yidin. When it came to obligation to punishment, they were Elech Yidin. They were careful on their kashrus. They were careful on their Shabbos. They were careful on the Lulav and Esrog. But how careful were they when they came to Gezela? How careful were they when it came to Lashon Hara? How careful were they when it came to what? When it came to other things, when it came to Mevai for Robin, or just contempt. How many times did they see a poor person go by and they had no Achmanis? They were only concerned with their own wealth and their own covered. How many times? It's not so simple, you see. It's not so simple. There were many Elecha Jews, but there's no question that there was a tremendous rotten core in that thing. Because if there wasn't a rotten core, that type of Holocaust could never happen. Because the Makatze couldn't get the koyach to do it. Just like the Makatze could not go over the Dor Floga and wipe them out. He just didn't have it. If he can do it, it's because he has the koyachas from the people themselves. And if in some way he can bring that kind of a tragedy, with that type of approach, in some way the Jews had practiced that type of situation among themselves, where they were never covered there, where there's a tremendous amount of sinas chinam. You question if there's sinas chinam, if there's hate for nothing? Ask yourself again. That's why the whole Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. Wait. What is the thing, what is the reason, and we'll get into more, why is Klal Yisrael been suffering so much? The Gemara says, why was the second Beis HaMikdash destroyed? Because of sinas chinam. Even the story of the second Beis HaMikdash, the Banishim showed the Jews why the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, by the actual cause which led up to the Beis HaMikdash. What happened? There was a person, right? There was a person who once invited, he had a friend, Kamsa, and by accident the invitation was sent to a fellow Bar Kamsa, who was his enemy. So it turned out he saw his enemy was invited to his simcha, whatever it was. And he said to the guy, "You're my enemy, what are you doing here? Get out." So the guy said, "I beg of you. I realize and so on, I'll pay for everything I'll sit in the back. I'll pay for everything. But don't mavayish me b'rabim. Don't throw me out like a bouncer from your simcha." You see. What did he do? He threw him out. Terrible sinas chinam. Look what he did. And that person then went ahead to the Roman governor and he reported them and he started making tzoros, and from that the whole Churban Beis HaMikdash came from that story. Where? Where did it come from? Because suddenly the Sultan, that was the thing, the Sultan ran up to Buddhism and says, Gewalt, what is going on here? These people hate each other for no reason at all. They're jealous of each other. They give each other iron horus. That's all they do all day long. What's going on over here? So the Makatze says, I have therefore the right to punish them with sinas chinam. And he did. He ran down, and the whole story was an act of what? Hate. And the Kamais of Bar Kamsa and Kamsa Bar Kamsa was what destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. But where would the Sultan get the ability to destroy the Beis HaMikdash? From the hate of the Jews, Chatoim of the Jews. And he destroyed the Beis HaMikdash with the very hate itself, which was responsible for it. If the Jews wanted to look around and say, why was the Beis HaMikdash destroyed? You don't have to go to a Navi for it. You don't have to have a Batko. Just look at the cause. Look at the immediate event which happened. You see. Which happened, why? Moshe Rabbeinu said to Banishim, why is it that the Jews are suffering Mitzrayim for so many years? What did they do that was so bad? So the Banishim said, I'll give you an answer. I'll show you directly. I'm not going to answer. You'll see. So what happened? So he protected one Jew against an Egyptian. He killed the Egyptian to protect the Jew. And Dr. Aviram saw it, and they ratted. They went and they snitched on him to the Egyptian government. And they wanted to kill Moshe Rabbeinu. So Moshe Rabbeinu says, now I know. Now I know. Now I understand why the Jews are in such tsuras. There's a tsuras because why? There's a tsuras because of tremendous amount of rechiyus and lashon hara and sinner between them. You see, you're talking about the prevalence of ayin haras, but ayin hara fundamentally is depending on Kittel. That's true. But why is someone getting ayin haras? Because of sinner chinam half the time. Half the time, one person is giving another person an ayin hara. Why? Because he's jealous of not something that he needs. He's jealous of some luxury that the person has. Oh, he has a what? He has a what? He has a Lincoln Continental. Why am I jealous of a Chevrolet and he has a Lincoln Continental? That's the ayin hara. Is the ayin hara is why do I have to walk to work? And he's able to drive a Chevrolet. That's not the ayin hara. The ayin hara is luxury. The ayin hara is why does he have that $700,000 mansion? You see, and I only have this small little, I have to rent my apartment, and he can walk into his center hall mansion in the middle of ballpark. That's the ayin hara. What kind of ayin hara is that? Why? That's sin and chinam. So the Baruch said to Moshe Rabbeinu, I have to send you in Golus. You're the Mashiach. And since you're the Mashiach, you have to suffer for your nation, so that they can survive. Oh, you want to know why you have to suffer? You want to know why you have to Golus? The very thing that will bring you into Golus is the reason. Why? The very fact that you have to go into Golus, you see, will be the reason that you have to go into Golus. The circumstance which will force you in Golus is the reason itself. The reason why you must go into Golus is because why? Because somebody snitched on you, Rechilis. That is the cause of the Golus. And that's the cause of their tsuras. That's how the Baruch answered him. So what? You think that the Jews of Europe were bigger tzaddikim than what? Than what do you call them? Because of Yisrael? What? The Zerah Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? But we think they were bigger? Not necessarily. Why? Because everyone went to the Beis Medrash at night? You can go to Beis Medrash all night long, and you can be a Malach Hashem Tzvokos. And suddenly in the morning you open your mouth and you can damage who knows how many people. With all the Torah that you learn, you can be a Baki B'Shatz. And you can go to all Gemaras, right? And you can be Mavayish. Who knows how many people believe with your learning? So what are we dealing with here? You can go to one and buy the most beautiful Ulama network and sit for 2 hours to examine. Maybe it's going to have some kind of a gum, you see. And you walk out with a beautiful Ulama network and think that you're some kind of a tzaddik, you see. And then as soon as you walk out, you get into a conversation with somebody and someone says, hey, what about that guy? That guy is a jerk. Shlemiyah, Shlemazel. What do you have to do with him? What happened here? What good is your Lulu and Esther? What did you do with your shuckling? That's the problem. So your tendency is to say to yourself, wait a minute, why did the Baruch punish Klal Yisrael? Like the Baruch is the beast. That's right. That's the implication. What right did the Baruch have to do this? What kind of chutzpah did the Baruch have that he should do a terrible thing to the Jews like this? What did these tzaddikim deserve? No. It's Klal Yisrael who's the beast. And it's the Baruch who wants to be muscle them. Because the Holocaust saved that generation. By the time the Germans were finished with the Jews, the Germans and the entire most of Europe was emptied of Kedusha. And the Jews had it all back. That's what it was. The Germans ate the Jews. But in eating the Jews, they and all of Europe died in the process. Except that you don't see it yet. But their death is almost here. That's what the Holocaust did. That Holocaust was such a feast of the Goyim that almost all of them died. And what you simply see are the last bones. Because that's what a Holocaust is. A Holocaust is a redemption for the Jews. But if it has to happen that way, if that's the way, if that's the tzura, if that's the form that the Einish takes, that's the form of the Chet. That's it. The Baruch simply turns around what you do. So that's it. You want to be Malamet Chus on the Jews? I choose to Malamet Chus on the Baruch Shalom.